evening and welcome to Chat Room. Montessori education and philosophy began in 1907 when Maria Montessori opened the first classroom in Rome. Since then it's gone from strength to strength all around the world, and here in Napier, New Zealand's first trilingual Montessori early childhood education centre has opened. To tell us more about that and Montessori in general is my guest tonight, Vicky Lumsden. Vicky, good evening, welcome to the show.
Thanks.
Now, in my research for this interview, Maria Montessori, what an amazing woman, a physician, an educator, a humanitarian and a feminist in 1907. What encouraged her to start Montessori?
She started out as a doctor, and she was one of the first female doctors in Italy. So she had a passion for working with children, and that led her into then working with disadvantaged children. And that's when the opportunity to open the Casa dei Bambini in Rome happened. So, you know, she went from being a doctor and moving into education, which is why observation is a big part of our thing from her medical background.
So yes, when we look at her founding principles, which I presume Montessori is still the same today, observation is the first one. What else is there?
Freedom of movement for children. Whilst that might seem quite normal in an early childhood setting, in a primary setting traditionally children were in a classroom with a teacher at a blackboard, and in Montessori they're moving around the classroom, they're choosing their own work. Some might be working independently, some might be working in a small group, some might be working with a teacher. So freedom of movement looks quite different in a Montessori primary class, it's quite dynamic. And the children also, the self-directed learning carries on right through. So it's part of the Montessori philosophy that children are working on their own development.
So what about independence too? There are quite strong theory on children's independence.
So in a Montessori 3 to 6 class, there is a range of materials called practical life, and those can include things that are dressing frames. So there's a button frame to help children with buttons, and hooks and eyes, and a lacing frame for shoelaces, and all those things that when we're busy parents rushing out the door we might just do for our children because it's quicker and we need to get them in the car. But at Montessori 3 to 6 they have the time to, you know, accomplish those things, and when they say I did it myself, and you know you can see that smile, and you know they just are really excited that they've done things for themselves. So it could also be a practical life activity like pouring a jug. Often mums or dads are the ones that pour the milk on the cereal in the morning, and they will do spooning and pouring activities and develop those skills of independence.
You see, I realised I'm guilty of that. I have a 6-year-old and I haven't been letting her pour the milk on her cereal. Obviously that's incredibly important though, that they have that independent activity.
Yes, and for like even the likes when we started last term of children getting a glass and a jug of water and pouring themselves their own water, some would say, I can't do this, I need help. And you know, when they did achieve it by themselves, you know, 4 or 5 weeks later, you could see that elated look. I poured my own water, you know, because they're used to having someone do it for them. And when they can do it themselves, it gives them a big sense of satisfaction and independence.
Now what about the Montessori philosophy on correcting the child?
Right, so often, as much as possible, you're looking at doing role modelling for children, and we use the Virtues program as part of our, if you like, behaviour management, and looking at grace and courtesy. Grace and courtesy is part of the Montessori curriculum. So for things like, you know, if you're bumping into a child or saying excuse me, and some of those sort of old-fashioned courtesies that sort of might not be so prevalent these days. So some people see Montessori as quite old-fashioned, but grace and courtesy is definitely part of our Montessori program.
And the absorbent mind, explain that to me.
So again, from her medical background, when she was observing young children, she found that they had sensitive periods and that absorbent mind where they just soak things up. So sometimes, you know, you can say a word that you might not want a child to hear at home and they'll repeat it. And they soak up everything around them. So she felt that if you put a prepared environment together that had specific materials that would, you know, really support their own development, their independence and their education. And so the absorbent mind is sort of from 3 to 6, that's why she has the prepared Montessori classrooms in those 3-year age brackets. And the sensitive periods now are actually kind of researchers catching up with her, and I'm not sure if you've been to a brainwave trust presentation,
yes.
but they have critical periods and they actually parallel with what Montessori had over 100 years ago. So yeah.
So what about the use of the words no and stop?
Those still will get used, but possibly instead of maybe yelling across the room, we might go and say, oh, you know, what virtue was missing there, and they might have a little think. We might go over to the peace mat and look at the virtues cards, and they might get the virtue of kindness or friendliness and say, oh, I forgot friendliness, or I need to remember to be kind.
So it's a lot about respect for others as well?
Yes. So there's 3 key things in Montessori: respect for yourself, respect for others, and respect for the environment. So respect for self can be things like, you know, if a child needs to blow their nose, we don't do it for them. We say, you know, you need to go and get a tissue, you need to go and look in the mirror, and you need to blow your nose, and you need to put it in the rubbish, and you need to go and wash your hands. So they're doing it all themselves, we're not doing it for them.
Now, let's talk a little bit about self-directed learning. What does that mean in Montessori terms?
Well, there's a term in Montessori called normalisation, which maybe to someone not involved in education isn't a nice term, but that's sort of the stage when children get to the point where they independently are choosing their own work and working with it, putting away, choosing something else. So in a Montessori environment, self-directed learning is the child having choice. If a new child's starting out, we spend time with them introducing them to the materials, because there's a whole variety of things for them to play and work with. And then they'll go back to things that they've been shown and use them. Like, we've got a puzzle map of South America, and a little boy that started a few weeks ago, he loves that, and throughout his day he might go back to the puzzle map of South America and a puzzle map of New Zealand several times. So there's freedom of choice, but there's also that self-directed learning of fulfilling what they're into.
Tonight we're hearing about Montessori education from Vicky Lumsden. We'll hear more about a typical day in a Montessori classroom coming up next. Welcome back to Chat Room. Tonight we're hearing about Montessori education with my guest this evening, Vicky Lumsden. Vicky, we're talking about the children having self-directed learning. Does that mean that the Montessori teacher has to come up with, 25 individual work plans?
Not necessarily. We do have an individual plan for each child that will involve different parts of the curriculum. So there'll be things that we are working with them in sensorial, things that we're working them in practical life. Like if they've learnt to do the buttons and the domes, then we'll introduce them to hooks and eyes and tying bows and those kind of things. So the Montessori environment is already set up in sequential, format, but we do have individual plans for each child, and we discuss those with families each term when we meet with them for parent interviews.
So you have in your classroom 3 to 6 year olds. How does that work, having that age range?
So that's typical of a Montessori environment. It carries on in primary with 6 to 9 and 9 to 12 classes, or sometimes, depending on the size of the school, 6 to 12. So it parallels in Māori education with the tuakana taina principle of the older one helping the younger one, but it's not always an age factor. So you might get a 3-year-old child who's really gifted in maths and can count into the hundreds, and you might have a 4-year-old who's just learning 1 to 10. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that it's always the older one helping the younger one. It can be different. They learn that they each have strengths.
How do you stop the older one taking over though sometimes, which can happen in a family?
When children work in Montessori, they choose a piece of material and they have a mat to work on, and so that's their area, their space. And if they want to leave that, they can get their name tag and put their name tag on their work. Or if I want to go and join a child, if I was one of the older ones wanting to take over, that child actually has the right to say, oh no, I just want to do this by myself, or to say, sure, you can join me and do it with them. Yeah.
So take me through a typical day in your classroom.
Okay, so we open at 8:30 in the morning, and from 8:30 till 9, we're all inside while children are settling and choosing work. And then from 9 till 12, Jan, our outside teacher, goes outside to the prepared environment outside, and I'm the inside teacher working inside, and the children have indoor-outdoor flow for that 3-hour work cycle. So often in other early childcare options, they might have a mat time or a music time where they all gather. In Montessori, we have a 3-hour work cycle that's where the children aren't interrupted, so they've got that time to work on things. If they're working on a 1,000 bead chain, it can, you know, go over days. So the uninterrupted period of time for them to get into concentrated deep work's important.
Do you have people say to you, how on earth do children concentrate for 3 hours? A lot of adults can't.
Sure, it's not that they're concentrating on one specific thing always for 3 hours. I mean, some children might have a 10-minute attention span when they start, so they'll go from one thing, do an activity, put it away, go to another thing. It's not that they're sitting down, they can go in, out. They might be watering their sunflowers outside, get hot and then come in and then do some maths and then go over and read a book and then go back outside and play on a bike.
So is there a concern that, you know, when the children are, you know, involved in self-directed learning, they can just wander from activity to activity, that they don't actually focus and concentrate on any one thing?
Children learn to follow through and complete things. So when they're first demonstrated, they get shown how to build the complete pink tower or how to do word building, and they go through the process of them packing it up when they're finished. So children tend to complete the work that they've done. I mean, not all pieces of work take a lot of time, but there's also, you get lots of children repeating things. So they might do the button frame 10 times in a row. They might rebuild the puzzle map of South America 4 times in a row. There's no, oh, you've done that, you need to put it away. Children can spend with the materials as long as they want to.
So where does fantasy and imaginative play fit into the Montessori curriculum?
That's always a bone of contention. Lots of people have the misconception of fantasy and Montessori is only in reality. Most Montessoris don't have a dress-up corner, and that tends to be the, oh, well, what about the drama and things? Children are naturally spending time creating or recreating what they see at home. The difference with Montessori is that we don't necessarily promote things that are in fantasy, such as Spider-Man or Ben 10 or all of those kind of programs, or so many things with violence. More looking at children in peaceful relationships or family situations and those kind of things. That's more of a focus than in a fantasy world.
So how do you see the role of television?
Most Montessoris promote that the less TV the better. I personally in my life have chosen to bring my daughter up without a television. So that's one of the things where Montessori parallels with Steiner education, is that learning to communicate in a family and contribute in a family is seen as more important than vegging out in front of the TV or learning about play fighting games and things that aren't real.
What about computers?
Computers, obviously they weren't around in Maria Montessori's day. Most 3 to 6 classes don't have a computer for the children to play games and things on, but they're often used in a Montessori primary class for research and things like that. In time we'll look at using digital photos with children. At the moment we scrapbook them by hand, but often maybe before we get the photos printed we'll use a laptop to talk about which photos they choose to get printed.
Now the specialist equipment is an important part of the Montessori equipment and curriculum. What sorts of things do you use? It's very hands-on equipment, isn't it?
Yes, and it's all sequential. So when the children come to us, there's number rods, so they're learning to count. You know, children might already be able to count to 10 or 20, but they can't necessarily count 1 to 1, and they'll go along a number rod, say, of 10, and go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So they learn that. Then there's spindles, so they're again taking out the spindles, and we introduce the concept of 0, having none, and then there's 1 spindle and 1 going up to 9. And again, there's usually a self-correcting element in Montessori materials, so the children might get to the box and come and say, Vicky, 1's missing, but we go back and count them together, and then they might find, oh, they put 9 and where it should have been 8 or something like that. And there's again, one side of the room's numeracy, another side of the room's literacy. We have culture materials, geography, puzzle maps. There's a phenomenal amount of Montessori materials in a classroom.
Tonight, hearing about Montessori education from Vicky Lumsden, who has recently set up a trilingual Montessori early childhood centre here in Napier. More on that shortly. Welcome back to Chat Room. Tonight, hearing about Montessori with my guest Montessori teacher, Vicky Lumsden. Vicky, if a child stays with you from 3 to 6, where do they go after that to continue their Montessori education?
There's a Montessori primary class at Port Ahuriri School, and we've also got families that are looking at maybe creating a new Montessori trilingual trust and looking at creating another class of special character for our children to go on to in the future.
Now, how much of the state curriculum do you have to incorporate into Montessori?
Well, the Te Whāriki, which is the early childhood curriculum for New Zealand, is a very flexible document, so everything within the Montessori curriculum can easily fit into what Te Whāriki covers, so it more than covers, it exceeds what's in there. Often what the materials that are in a Montessori 3 to 6 class can parallel with what a child might get in class 3 or 4 at a primary school. So
I presume you still have ERO visits and all those sorts of things, so you must comply in that regard?
Absolutely, and we had to meet all the same requirements as in any early childhood centre as a kindy, so all the building requirements and everything else with qualifications and things like that. Just in a Montessori, you then have Montessori qualifications and experience and training on top of your early childhood. And all our teachers are actually primary trained as well as early childhood trained, so we're kind of OTT in that department.
Now, in this results-driven society of ours, where our children are getting reports, in Montessori, how do you track and then report back to the parents on how their children are doing and what's happening with their learning?
So that probably is a difference to a lot of other early childhood options for families. In most Montessori centres, teachers do record the actual lessons that they're doing with children, so that then they can help plan what materials they're going to show next in the sequential range. At Montessori 3 to 6, having been a primary principal, I really value interviews with families, so we have 20-minute family interviews every term to share what we've been doing and set goals for the following term.
Now, one of the myths associated with Montessori is that it's only for well-behaved, quiet children.
Right.
Because the environment is so calm and so quiet. Talk me through that.
Right. So we have everyday children. You can come to Montessori and it will not always be calm and quiet, but we've just had a teacher trainee on practicum for 4 weeks, and one of her evaluative comments was that she couldn't get over the calmness. Often that eventuates because children are choosing their work and they're engaged with many